General Biology, and welcome to Section 4.2, Chapter 4, Niches and Community Interactions. So now we're going to look at the roles that organisms have within their communities, and we're going to look more specifically at the interactions that take place within those communities. Now that we have an idea about climate and the greenhouse gases, we can go one step further with this. So if someone were to ask you where an organism lives, that person might answer, depending on the organism, oh, on a coral reef or in a desert or in a forest. And these answers that you see here are actually the environment or the location. But ecologists, when they're studying an organism, they need more information to fully understand why an organism lives where it does and how it fits into the surroundings. So there's a lot more that we need to know, and we're going to ask, well, what else do we need to know? And so we're going to learn another term, and that term is going to be niche. So we're going to find out what a niche is, and as it says here as the answer, it's the range of physical and biological conditions in which a species lives, and it's the way that species obtains what it needs in order to survive and reproduce. I said in a different screencast that, you've probably heard somebody say, oh, I'm so glad Ethelbert finally found her niche. In other words, she found her place where she belongs, and that's what they're saying. And the same holds true for all organisms. They have a specific role, and they have a way that they use the biological conditions within their environment, and they also have a way of obtaining what they need in order to survive and to reproduce, because that's the whole idea, is to keep producing the offspring so that species still exists. So one of the things that we're going to consider within a niche is something known as tolerance. And a species has its own range of what it can tolerate. Like temperature range. When we think about squirrels, I think I see squirrels most of the winter long. They do hibernate on the really, really cold days. They're not as active as they are in the summertime, but they're still out and about. You see them scurrying around trying to find the nuts where they hid them. And they can tolerate a wide range of temperatures. If it's really cold, then they wind up staying in their nest. Where there's things like lizards that don't really do well here in the north, and they either have to really hibernate and bury themselves deep below the freeze line, or they have to migrate out in order to survive. So that tolerance is the ability to survive and reproduce under a range of environmental circumstances. So it's important that you look at graphics and that you're able to interpret the graphics. So here's a graph that shows you population numbers, and as you go up, the populations are going to increase, and as you go down, the populations are going to decrease. And then here is the range of their environmental variables. And the variables are anything that's going to change. The temperature for one, the amount of precipitation for the other, maybe their habitat. We lose leaves in the fall in this area. So they might depend on that leaf for their food. So anything like that. So here's an area that's going to have low environmental changes to an area that's going to have high environmental changes. So when we take a look at the organisms, when they reach this peak right here, they're surviving within this optimal range. Okay, and this is that optimal range that we're talking about. If they deplete if they cannot survive with the change, if the change is too extreme, then those numbers are going to fall down. If the conditions aren't just right for their survival, they're not going to be able to grow either. So this is in the middle. This is the optimal range where you're going to see the most productivity within those organisms, so they can tolerate that. So when an environment condition such as temperature extends in either direction beyond an organism's optimum range, like we're seeing here in this graph, the organism is going to experience stress. And that organism must expend more energy to maintain the homeostasis, that internal balance, and so has less energy left for the growth and reproduction. So that's how they have to be able to maintain and survive, so that they can maintain that energy that they have so that they can continue on. Organisms have an upper and a lower limit of tolerance for every environmental factor. Beyond those limits, the organisms cannot survive. So that's why we see the decrease when we're at the really upper limits and extreme lower limits of this. So a species' tolerance for an environmental condition helps determine its habitat. And its habitat is the general place where that organism is going to be able to live, be productive, thrive, and be able to go through its life processes effectively. So within that habitat, an organism has a role, or something that we call a niche. And this describes not only the environment where that organism lives, but how it interacts with the biotic and abiotic factors in the environment. So that niche is going to be the full range of everything that it needs. Its dependencies on the abiotic factors and the biotic factors, the interactions that it's going to have with other organisms, other communities, other populations. It's also going to be the way that it uses these things to be able to survive and reproduce. You think of a niche for an organism, and you might think, well, it's a predator, it's a prey, so that's a certain role that it has. If it's a predator, what does it depend on? So I think of a mountain lion. A mountain lion lives in the rocky areas of mountains, and it feeds off of rodents like rats and squirrels and rabbits, okay, and maybe even skunks and raccoons, some bigger animals like that. And its job is to help keep these numbers of rabbits or squirrels, the population numbers, down, so that they don't just keep reproducing and blow the carrying capacity of the area that they live in. So that predator's job is population control. So what they rely on is referred to as a resource. And a resource can be any necessity of life. It can include water, it can include nutrients, it could include the amount of light. You think of plants and the amount of sunlight that they need. Food availability or space. Bears can't live in a small area effectively. They need a much larger area in order to survive. So that space would be a resource for them. So when we think about plants, as I already said, sunlight is going to be one of their resources, as well as water and soil and nutrients. Would be resources for plants. For animals, the resources could be the nesting place, like we were talking about the squirrel. It could be a shelter. We've been walking Alvathorpe Park, and there's this beautiful wild rose bush, and really it's a member of the rose family. It's not a true rose, and it's hollowed out underneath. And because it's thorny, it protects the deer. The deer actually go in and they lay underneath there. The leaves protect them against the rain and the elements, and it protects them against predators that can't get in through the thorns. So that's shelter. The types of food that the organisms eat and the places where the organisms feed are all a part of the niche. So an organism's niche, as we've already said, involves those abiotic factors that it requires for survival. And we're going to talk, that's going to include water, that's going to include temperature, that's going to include the amount of sunlight or the chemistry of the water. Is it salt water? Is it fresh water? Is it brackish? Brackish is a combination of fresh and salt water. So those are going to be some examples of the abiotic factors. Amphibians, we talked about lizards, they lose and absorb water through their skin. So they need to live in moist places. And that's why the rich humus of the temperate forest is so good for some salamanders and lizards. If the area is too hot or too dry or too cold for too long, then most of the amphibians aren't going to be able to survive really well. Iguanas do really good in the warmer climates. They don't do so well in the colder climates. They can start to retain fluid around their liver and their lungs, and they wind up dying. And that's why they don't make really good pets, because you have to keep the humidity and the heat a constant temperature year-round. So when we consider the biotic aspects of a niche, we're looking at the biological, and this is going to require things for survival like how it reproduces. Is it a sexual reproducer? Is it an asexual reproducer? Does it bud to reproduce? Is it through a process of fragmentation? These are examples of asexual reproduction. Vegetative propagation. Do you break a piece off and can you transplant it? The food that it eats and where it eats that food and how it obtains that food. There's an island called Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean, and this has certain bird species on it, and all of them live in the same habitat, but they eat different fish and different sizes of fish, and they feed in different places. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the competitive exclusion principle and how that fits in. But each bird has a different place where they're going to be eating a different size fish, so that they're not in big competition with each other. So the species occupies this distinct niche. So one of the things I mentioned is competition, and we're going to see how competitions shape communities in this next situation, and we're going to consider how species divide their resources and how that competition helps them to determine the numbers and kinds of species that are in the community and the niche each species occupies. I'm going to end the screencast here so that we can just start up with competition and not end it in this one.